Please pause the presentation and read this disclaimer. When you're ready, press play to continue. The topic of this presentation is the Kentucky-specific Kentucky Administrative Regulation, or KAR, for medical services and first aid, and how it has changed. This presentation will also provide a general overview of the federal standard as adopted by Kentucky and how it applies to medical advice for the workplace, first aid, and first aid supplies. Here is the most recent version of the KAR for medical services and first aid standard. The KAR is no longer in effect, however. The federal standard will now be used for compliance for the medical services and first aid standard. Please pause the presentation and look over the standard. Then we'll go over what has changed in the next slides. These highlighted terms appear in the KAR, but are key terms that are also present in the federal standard. Familiarity with these terms could benefit an employer as they become acquainted with the federal standard. More information will be provided about these terms in future slides. The sections that have been crossed out are the sections of the KAR that are not present in the federal standard. What can be seen is that certain requirements of the KAR are no longer present. The main requirement that was present in the KAR that is not present in the federal standard is the requirement for employers with 8 or more employees to ensure an employee is adequately trained to provide first aid services. This requirement is not present in the federal standard. So what is in the KAR that matches the federal standard? This is the information from the KAR that matches the federal standard. While this information does not constitute the full federal standard, it is very similar. And here is the current federal standard that details the medical services and first aid requirements for employers, 29 CFR 1910.151, Section A and B. The requirements of the 1910.151 standard are in place now for Kentucky. These newly highlighted terms are additional terms used in the federal standard not found in the KAR. So what are the requirements of the medical services and first aid standard? Section A indicates that it is the employer's responsibility to ensure that medical personnel are available to advise on issues related to the safety and health of employees at the establishment. If your workplace is relying on outside emergency services to provide treatment for injured employees, typically an infirmary, clinic, hospital, or some ambulatory care service, can satisfy the section's requirement with the services they provide. Emergency medical treatment can also be provided by evacuating an employee to an off-site facility within 3 to 4 minutes for life-threatening injuries. It's important for the employer to consider potential constraints these entities may have, because it may be necessary for the employer to make a special agreement with these entities to ensure that their services are readily available to employees. Some things to consider are railroad tracks, traffic, bridges, time of day, etc. Section B indicates that if the medical treatment facilities are not able to respond to provide treatment to an injured employee within acceptable response times for the type of business, then individuals must be trained to render first aid at the establishment. The term near proximity does not designate a specific distance or response time for the medical treatment facilities. Instead, the term near proximity assumes that the employer has the responsibility in determining the necessary response time for medical services based on the severity of the hazards at their establishment and their employees' potential exposures. These response times could range anywhere from 3 minutes to 15 minutes based on the severity of hazards. The longer response time, up to 15 minutes, may be reasonable for an office where the likelihood of serious injury is remote, where a 3 to 4 minute response is needed for severe and life-threatening incidents. The last detail of this section is to ensure that employees have access to first aid supplies. A final note is that other first aid requirements exist outside these general requirements. There may be different first aid requirements for other industries, and it would be important for employers to verify if these requirements apply to their establishments. The terms mentioned in the previous slides are important for an employer to understand as they comply with the medical services and first aid standard. In this and the following slide, those terms are explained in more detail. The highlighted sections of the explanations attempt to emphasize important aspects of the key terms. Plant health, the overall safety and health condition of the employees in the plant. Ready availability. The term readily available is not defined in the standard for first aid supplies. However, responding in a timely manner can mean the difference between life and death. Therefore, the person who has been trained to render first aid must be able to quickly access the first aid supplies. The first aid supplies should be located in an easily accessible area, and the first aid provider generally should not have to travel through several doorways, hallways, and/or stairways to access the first aid supplies. Near proximity. While the standards do not prescribe a number of minutes, OSHA has long interpreted the term near proximity to mean that emergency care must be available within no more than 3 to 4 minutes from the workplace. An interpretation has been upheld by the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission and by federal courts. OSHA recognizes that a somewhat longer response time of up to 15 minutes may be reasonable in workplaces such as offices where the possibility of such a serious work-related injury is more remote. Adequately trained. OSHA recognizes any nationally accepted and medically sound first aid program that covers the fundamentals of first aid as meeting the requirements stated in 29 CFR 1910.151. The specific content of first aid programs must be consistent with the work environment in question and the type of work being done. Employers in general industry providing first aid training must ensure it adequately covers the type of injuries and illnesses likely to be encountered in their workplaces and is kept up to date with current first aid techniques and knowledge. The following slides address the common questions often associated with the Federal First Aid Standard. Again, the highlights have been added just for emphasis. To whom does the standard apply? The standard applies to all employers in general industry, regardless of size. Does it apply to offices? Yes, the standard applies to offices. Does it apply to construction? First aid and medical attention requirements for construction can be found under 29 CFR 1926.23. I work on a farm. Does this apply to me? The standard applies to all employers in general industry, regardless of size, so in this case it does not apply, although employers should consider it due to the possible remoteness of the work site. I work in a city or county in Kentucky. Does it apply to me? Yes, the standard applies to all public entities in Kentucky. What other industries have specific requirements under general industry? Other industries in general industry, 29 CFR 1910, include 1910.266, logging operations, 1910.269, electrical power generation, transmission, and distribution, and 1910.401 through 440, commercial driving operations. What should be included in a first aid kit? Appendix A to 1910.151, First Aid Kits, Non-Mandatory, states that there is an example of the minimal contents in a generic first aid kit and is described in ANSI Z308.1, 1998. The contents of the kit listed in the ANSI standard should be adequate for small work sites. With larger or multiple operations, employers should determine the need for additional first aid kits, additional types of first aid equipment, and additional quantities and types of supplies in the first aid kits. First aid kits should also be assessed periodically. For first aid kits, what is meant by readily available? The person trained must be able to quickly access the supplies. The first aid kits should be located in an easily accessible area and generally not have to travel through several doorways, hallways, or stairs to access the supplies. Is there a standard for placing first aid kits in cabinets? It's the employer's responsibility to assess the particular needs of the workplace and to tailor the first aid kits and their placement to those specific needs. Can first aid kits be locked in a cabinet? Yes, first aid cabinets can be locked, however they must be readily accessible in the event of emergency. Locking the cabinet may limit accessibility. Is having personnel trained in adult CPR an OSHA requirement? OSHA recommends that CPR training be a general program element of a first aid program. However, some OSHA standards have specific requirements that employees be trained in first aid and CPR. If an employer is covered by one of these specific standards, CPR training would be required. CPR training is required by logging, permit-required confined space entry, and electric power generation. Can emergency medical treatment services be a fire department or emergency medical technician? Yes, those are equivalent to the infirmary, clinic, or hospital language. However, arrangements must be made with the emergency medical treatment services to provide treatment and verify they can always be available within the time frame needed. What if emergency medical treatment is not available? The employer must ensure treatment of an injured employee is available and readily accessible. Where can I go in Kentucky if I still have questions? You can call KYSAFE at 502-564-3070 for questions and clarifications. You can also visit our website at kysafe.ky.gov. The employer has the responsibility to assess the severity of the hazards their employees have potential exposure to when working at the establishment. As part of this assessment, it is important for the employer to consider how first aid and emergency treatment will be handled. If the result of an employee being exposed to these hazards would lead to serious injury, it would be necessary for the employer to ensure first aid and emergency treatment could respond in 3 to 4 minutes. However, if exposure to the hazards would result in a less serious injury, then a longer response time, up to 15 minutes, could be considered. Other serious injuries, in addition to those listed on the slide, include fractures, burns or scalds, electric or chemical, crushing, concussion, and cuts and lacerations. If you are relying on an outside emergency medical treatment service or evacuating an employee to an off-site facility, you should consider, if emergency treatment is available, and make arrangements with the service. What will you do if the service is not available, and how will you know when the service will not be available? Here are a select number of OSHA letters of interpretation, which provide more information and specific detail related to the first aid standard. These letters of interpretation are important because they allow for more context and clarification when it comes to understanding how an employer can comply with the medical services and first aid standard. A companion PDF that contains links to all these letters of interpretation is available for download. In summary, this presentation has covered how providing medical services and first aid requirements in Kentucky have changed. Specifically, the presentation discussed how the previous KAR is no longer in effect, and instead these requirements follow 29 CFR 1910.151 in the federal standard. The Medical Services and First Aid Standard considers the availability of medical personnel for employees and the response time of medical services for injured employees. These letters of interpretation will provide more details related to the standards. More specific first aid requirements exist for those employers involved in other industries, such as logging, electrical power generation, and commercial driving. Remember, the primary requirement of this standard is to ensure prompt first aid for injured employees. This can be done by ensuring that emergency medical treatment services can respond within the time frame needed to provide treatment, or having trained first aid providers at the worksite to respond within the time frame needed to administer life-saving measures. This concludes the First Aid Requirements update for Kentucky. For more free online learning opportunities, please visit our website. And as always, thank you for watching this presentation.